I think at the moment we're operating in probably one of the most competitive talent markets in years, right? Particularly when it comes to these go-to-market roles. Everyone's chasing the same high performers. In that environment, I guess, how does a scaling business actually stand out from the rest?
The highest performers have got multiple options before they've even considered moving. And I think it's really sort of changed a lot in terms of how people are looking for roles as well. And companies that have got the visibility and credibility really sort of come to the forefront. Top performers are not applying for roles. I think it's changed now. They're getting so much traction in their LinkedIn inbox or email, etc. And I think the way that they're looking at companies is very different as well. So the companies that are invisible, they're already out the race very early in the stage. And I think also candidates are researching companies so much more than what they used to do.
Welcome back to another episode of Growth Unlocked. I'm your host, Kieran. Today, I'm lucky to be joined by David Law. He's the founder of Fulcrum, who works with scaling businesses to build hiring systems that actually drive real growth and not just fill seats. We're going to unpack what separates companies that consistently win top talent from those that keep scrambling. We're going to cover where most businesses get hiring wrong, how to build a repeatable hiring engine, and what employer branding really means today. If you're a founder or go-to-market leader trying to scale, I think this conversation is going to give you the playbook that you need to attract, land, and keep the right people in place. David, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks so much, Kieran. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, likewise. Let's do it. So, David, I think at the moment we're operating in probably one of the most competitive talent markets in years, right? Particularly when it comes to these go-to-market roles. Everyone's chasing the same high performers. And, in that environment, I guess, how does a scaling business actually stand out from the rest?
Yeah, I think it's good question. And I think it's interesting. I think we've definitely experienced during COVID how things have changed from a talent perspective and talent becoming front and center. And then probably had a little bit of a dip off last year, but it seems to be firing on all cylinders or hiring on all cylinders again now. So I think it's a really competitive sport, talent now, and the highest performers have got multiple options before they've even considered moving. And I think it's really sort of changed a lot in terms of how people are looking for roles as well. And I think therefore, like companies that have got the visibility and credibility really sort of come to the forefront. Top performers are not applying for roles. I think it's changed now. They're getting so much traction in their LinkedIn inbox or email, etc. So, and I think the way that they're looking at companies is very different as well. So the companies that are invisible, they're already out the race very early in the stage. And I think also candidates are researching companies so much more than what they used to do. It's almost like they're researching companies like a buyer would research, a brand, So I think for me, I think now for founders, like founder presence really matters. Way that a company and shows up and leadership shows up is really, really important to candidates. And it's no longer about just posting a job on LinkedIn or Seek and then just waiting for applicants to come. Like those, that is one method. But I think if you're doing that, you're leaving a lot. You're leaving a lot off the table. So, yeah, I think I used to say to companies that if you're on LinkedIn today or someone's on Glassdoor or TikTok or whatever channel one's on now from a social perspective, what would they understand about your company? Why would they joining them would be a really smart career move, etc. And so I think most couldn't answer yes to that. So I think there's a lot probably there to unpack, turning employees into advocates and building trust, with those potential candidates, etc., which I'm sure we'll sort of unpack throughout this. But yeah, I think the way that companies show up now is super important. I think the companies that win talent are the ones that candidates already recognize and really know really, really well. And so you have to do that work up front now.
Yeah, some interesting points you've raised, and it almost sounds like, it kind of revolves around this whole concept of brand, right? And I think typically when most people think about a brand, it's sort of the perception from like a customer perspective, but there's definitely some sort of overlap here in terms of the employer brand. help me to understand that more, like unpack that in terms of like where is the overlap between, say, like general brand of a business from like a kind of marketing and sales and customer perspective versus the employer brand?
Yes, yeah, it's a good question again. Like a lot of the companies, especially go to market, they know their product. They've got their buyer personas. They know how to market their product. They do a phenomenal job. But when it comes to employer brand and attracting the top talent, which is ultimately their biggest asset and most expensive asset, and the reason how they can grow, most companies I think do a really, really weak job on it. If you're scoping out, for me, talent is no different from a go-to-market strategy. You do your market mapping, you do your employer branding, you know what your messages are. You got your value proposition down pat, and a lot of companies just don't do that. But taking it back to employer brand, I don't think it's necessarily about just the shiny stuff, that people see like posts on LinkedIn, etc. It's everything. It's how you message candidates. It's the information that they, how they digest that information. And, I think when, products are going out to market, they've got a real clear strategy on that. But again, when it comes to hiring, most companies might do a LinkedIn post. Mostly will go to a job ad, maybe do a LinkedIn carousel or a LinkedIn post, and then that's kind of it. And I think if you're doing that, there's a lot that you're missing. And as I said before, I think visibility beats everything, beats salary, etc. I think candidates now are researching so much more. If you think about people now, 50% of the workforce is now Gen Z, or getting up to close to 50% of the workforce is Gen Z, and they're researching things like never before, and not just work, but even much smaller decisions like hotels, restaurants, etc. Airlines. They're researching the life out of things before making an informed decision. Yet choosing a career is probably outside of buying a house is probably one of the most important decisions that you're going to be making. So I think candidates research everything now a lot more, and a lot of companies just don't think about that, and they just think that going to a company website is enough when it's just a very product facing website. So I think there's a really big opportunity, I think, for companies to get some good wins from an employer brand perspective, and that opportunity perception, I think, drives movement, and transparency as well builds trust. And again, Gen Z, I think it's very clear in the research that transparent approach really does win that cohort over. And as I said before, the top 5% are least likely to be applying for roles. They've got enough people coming into their inbox, and it's really important to make sure that every single touch point is on point and on brand. No different from if you were doing outreach messages for a go-to-market strategy. You would research the life out of that messaging, and I think it's and every single touch point along the buyer journey, and I think it should be no different when it comes to recruitment.
Yeah, you touched on a point around how a lot of companies do a lot of planning and strategizing when it comes to their actual go-to-market strategy. But it seems like that's something that probably doesn't get spoken about enough when it comes to the talent strategy, right? Firstly, like, why do you think that is? And then secondly, like, what are some really practical pieces of advice you could give a business leader around how to get that right?
I think most hiring mistakes happen before the role even goes to market. I think there's a lot of assumption-led hiring, and that can be really expensive. And again, if you're in a GTM environment, you would market map, you would know exactly who your customers are, you know what your competitors are doing, etc., etc. I think again, a good hiring function would do all those things as well before they've even written a job description, so they'd know, they've got salary alignment, they've got the candidate profiles, they know what the candidate profile looks like properly. They'd know what the talent density is, if there's a lot of mismatches there between what the perception and the reality is in terms of how many people are in market for a certain role, etc. And then, you'd understand what your competitors are doing. What are they offering? What's their perks and benefits? What's their growth plans for people? So you'd know all that, I think, from a GTM perspective, one would assume, for companies, but it's not really followed through when it comes to talent acquisition. And I think there's some real, not every company's going to have the nice sort of shiny tools that we would have, for example, to be able to market map. But there are some really easy ways in which one can do it, and pretty cost-effective ways in which you can get salary data. And I don't mean just the recruitment marketing salary surveys that are out there. I mean much more in depth than that. And you can put a lot of rigor into your salaries. I've mentioned a few times to people, there's ways in which you can, if you don't have a LinkedIn recruiter license, you can probably reverse engineer quite a lot of stuff on LinkedIn Sales Navigator. As just a couple of examples that you've probably already got already if you're in the GTM space, certainly on the sales side. So there's definitely a lot more rigor I think you can put on into your planning before you put together a job description, and that's just a couple of things to name, I think.
Love it. Yeah, some great advice there. I guess, where do you see most companies getting hiring wrong in today's market?
Well, I think mentioning that is probably, like one thing, in terms of doing your salary surveys, making sure you've done all your research, for example. But I think the biggest mistake that I see is companies treating hiring as an event rather than a capability. And what I bear in mind that it's very reactive. So, like I said, just somebody resigns, just get this job out straight away. When I think if you put a little bit more rigor into it, if you measure twice and cut once, then you get much better outcomes. So I think hiring when someone just resigns, that is a big issue, and just getting a job out there as quickly as you can, and whether that be just chucking it out to loads of recruiters without doing a thorough briefing call, or if you've got your own internal team, making sure that they're properly briefed and got the tools that they need to succeed. Because again, it's not just it can be an internal issue, or if one's not got either of those two resources, then making sure that you've done your due diligence to make sure that you can go out to market properly. But yeah, no workforce planning, no structured process, no ownership. It's constant urgency and reactive. And I don't think you'd build, again, bringing it back to the GTM landscape, I don't think you'd build a sales function only when revenue drops, So I think for me, the practical advice that I always give to companies is stop hiring when you're in sort of panic mode, and be prepared all the time. So we always like to say to companies, especially if they're in a tight market, and I know we've had this conversation offline, Kieran, but having an always on approach, and always having talent pools ready to go for those all important key roles that you need, is much better than just being reactive. So and I think assigning ownership as well, like it's, that you can, if it's a lean team, you can spread that across different people and have some ownership on these different things, so you can bring it all together and have a really good sort of hiring function. But I think that's and then on top of that, it's making sure that when you you've done your market mapping, the interview, your hiring manager's fully prepared, you've got really strong interview plans, etc., in place. You've got a really good pre-onboarding and onboarding strategy as well, because there's all these 1% things that make a massive difference. And I think if you drop them, then that's where your hiring function can go completely wrong.
Mm. Yeah, I think in general, that concept of being reactive and proactive is something that's applicable to most things in business, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, that's one thing that I can imagine is even more relevant when it comes to finding people, because often it does take probably like months, sometimes even longer, to be able to make sure that you've got the right candidates in the pipeline. Because like you were saying before, not everyone is looking for a job. In fact, like most of the best people that you want in your company are not looking for a job. So they might not even be interested or open to entertaining a conversation at that point in time. So, if you're kind of leaving it to the last minute, then yeah, there might be a lag. Probably is a pretty significant lag in terms of having that person come on board. And then it takes time to ramp that person up to get them to full productivity or capability to integrate them into the team, like you mentioned with that new hire onboarding process. So it sounds like ideally like companies should be probably looking ahead 6 months probably if they wanted to do it properly.
100%. I think one thing I always say to companies is like predictable growth requires predictable hiring, and yeah, it's hard. It's a hard thing to get your head around because I think most people are in that reactive mode, and and I understand the reasons why because it's just so busy. But to your point there, I've written lots of research, and 80% of job seekers are not looking for a job. And so yeah, like it's. I think you've just got to get that all in a row, and then if you do, then you can really that can really make a massive difference in your hiring engine for sure. So yeah.
I wanted to circle back to something you touched on earlier, Dave, just around the importance of, from an employee brand perspective, the
Mm.
founder or the founders, right? Even so, like the kind of the leaders within the business. That's something that I've seen some companies do really well, but the majority don't really put enough effort into that. That's one thing that I've noticed. I mean, I've been posting on LinkedIn for years, and one of the indirect benefits that we've seen out of that is just people know the name of the business, they know who I am, etc. It's quite fascinating because it was never really anything that I had considered too much. I mean, I was doing it more so from just an awareness perspective, both personally and also for the companies that I'm working at. But it was definitely one of those things that I found quite interesting. That whenever I would speak to a candidate, that they'd say something like, I've seen you, I've heard you before. Obviously, having like a podcast like this probably helps a little bit as well. But yeah, like what advice would you give founders that are not kind of getting their face out there and don't really have any kind of public presence?
Mm. It's hard. If I'm honest, like I struggle with it, because I'm a very private person. So it is very, very difficult, which is remarkable for me to say, given the position, like I'm in this space. But um, yes, I think that there's no question. Like obviously, LinkedIn's a great channel, and it's not just limited to LinkedIn. People do want to see more from leaders, and you've got your open channels like your LinkedIn, your TikToks, your Instagrams, etc., where depending on the industry and depending on the candidate, they're all going to go on different platforms. So your website, going to be looking at that, looking obviously in LinkedIn, and Australia is a very engaged LinkedIn market. I think it's second only to the US per capita in terms of engagement on LinkedIn, which is something I heard at a LinkedIn function last year. Um, but obviously TikTok as well, and the other sort of more Insta channels. But it's also on closed user groups as well, and it's something we really advocate for. And in terms of doing, trying to get in the inner sanctum of a business. So if when part of our playbook obviously is when we're on our outreach, we want to provide candidates with as much information as you possibly can. And I think one of the best channels that we've seen is doing interviews like this, but with the leadership team, because I think going back to that cohort, people want to know that transparency builds trust, and Gen Z and previous generations before then, they really want to know what it looks like within the business and what a leader stands for, their values. They want all their answers, the questions answered by these people. So yeah, I think definitely LinkedIn and that is such like low hanging fruit, and now with AI, it's 10 times easier, and and you would be doing it for your product, so why wouldn't you do it for your talent strategy? But not just that, it's also having really good channels as well that you can lean in on from closed channels. So as we do, for every role that we have and every business that we work with, we'll build out bespoke landing pages, etc., for the role. So we'll be doing interviews with the leaders, interviews with hiring managers, right the way down to what the staff are saying as well about working there. And that's not just in video format, but written format, etc. And it's really, really easy to turn it around now with AI. So I think it's definitely hard to get going for sure. But once you do, it really does pay dividends. And we've seen on the stats, like the most common watched thing that we send candidates now is founder leaders video content. It is by far the most clicked thing on our landing pages when we look at the heat map. So it definitely does resonate with talent. Um, so yeah, I definitely highly encourage it, and I think again, this is where companies get it wrong. They think that they're attracting talent is just by just sending out a 2-page job description, and that's no longer enough now. People need a lot more, and it's just so easy for leaders just to do that.
You touched on the topic of AI, which I'm pretty passionate about, and I know you are
Mm,
as well.
mm,
Uh, I'm going to put something out there. I'd love to get your perspective on this, David, and it might be a little bit kind of contrarian, but I watched a podcast with Mark Andreessen yesterday, and you know, not just him, but a lot of people that are kind of on the bleeding edge of this, right? Who are you know in a position to have access to a lot more information, have a lot more insight than I think most of us do, are talking about where he sees or where they see the future of work, right? In terms of what does an actual company look like? Who is it comprised of? Thinking about things like headcount, responsibilities. And I really do think that in 2026, we're going to see a pretty big shift in terms of how the workforce actually operates. And
mm,
what I mean by that is like, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be a massive issue with like job loss.
mm,
Um, I think what's going to happen is the low value, low level, more like repetitive, mundane tasks that people are doing are going to be replaced by AI, particularly with AI agents. And what that's going to do, I think, is force people, employees, etc., to have to think at the more strategic level, right? To be kind of operators where they might have agents that are kind of that they're managing or sitting underneath them, which ideally is going to allow them to focus on, as I said before, like more of these kind of value added type activities. So, like, what's your thought around that? Because I do feel like there's still a decent amount of resistance from a lot of companies and a lot of individuals that are not really embracing AI to its full capability. And I don't mean AI in the sense of going to ChatGPT and asking it for a recipe based off what food you've got left in the fridge, but actually using AI in a more thoughtful, meaningful way and kind of orchestrating a team of agents that can really handle more of the low level tasks that people do from a day to day perspective.
yeah, I completely agree with everything that you just said there. I still think it's got a little bit of time to go, but those that are not on this AI, it's still quite remarkable when you do speak to people. There is a resistance, uh, and also quite scarily, people thinking that this is just going to be a bit of it's going to die off, or it might, it's not going to be as big as what everyone says it's going to be. And I think those that think that are going to get well and truly left behind. I think there is some interesting data that we've seen recently in our talent analytics platform, where we have seen already some shifts in the labour market, especially at those junior roles. That does concern me a little bit, because I've started to see roles that perhaps would have been done by a junior now probably being taken over by AI and in certain industries, and that's a little bit of a concern for me already, seeing some of that data. But I do agree with you. I think there's this huge shift, and I think the ones that are able to, like use agents and be able to take those sort of those tasks that were just those administration tasks that were really just taking so much time out of the diary, and then being able to hand that off to a team of agents that can then work that through. That's where it gets really exciting for me. Look, I mean, we're already on that journey already, as you know, and for us, it's fantastic for us to be able to free up so much time for our talent partners to be able to focus their energy on their clients and their partners, rather than having to do extra sourcing work or extra administration work. And then now we've got agents now that are doing all that in the background, which is fantastic. And also it pays dividends for our partners as well, because if we can do that effectively, it means we can reduce our costs a little bit, perhaps, or we can bring on more partners. So it pays dividends for us and for everybody, I think. But yeah, I do think we're in a super interesting space. But it is what I'm seeing in terms of when most of our partners now want people that are AI first. I would say 70-80% of our partners are really talking about AI and in a big way. And for those that are and want that in our hiring process, and there's a lot of candidates still out there that are, like you said, still you just think that AI starts and stops at ChatGPT when there's a big wide world out there. So, which is quite interesting. It is quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, even our approach now is we're AI first, and it is quite remarkable when we're recruiting for ourselves. Talent partners to come on board if they haven't, that they're not using AI, and you ask the question, it could be because a company just doesn't do it. They don't want them on there, maybe for security reasons. But most companies are open to it, but they're not doing it, which I just find quite incredible. And it just shows for me, like, when you talk through like how long it takes them to do the tasks that are taking us half the time that it would take them, that's where I just can't understand why people wouldn't be on that AI journey at all. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting space.
So, David, I guess once a business has, got the contract out, it's been signed, that's great. Everyone's really happy about that. Celebrations, pop the champagne. I guess like from that point onwards, like that's often where there's a bit of a black hole, right? Once that offer is accepted, how should founders and business leaders think about pre-onboarding before they even start on day zero? And then the onboarding process, say for like the first sort of 90 days, even like 6 months within that role to really kind of ramp them up to full productivity?
Yeah. Look, I think joining decisions are emotional. We all know that. It's for everybody. And resignation decisions often happen really, really early. Like there's some great stats that I saw. The amount of people that are leaving in their first year, and the reason is because of a poor onboarding process. So I think for me, the expectation versus reality drives attrition a lot of the time. And I think there's sort of two parts to the onboarding, which I can sort of go through my thoughts. But there's that pre-onboarding stage, like you said, contracts got signed. What do we do then? And again, it's where a lot of companies get it wrong, I think. And if we think about going back to the GTM space, if you're onboarding a new client, you pop the champagne, but you put so much work into making sure that client is onboarded, and you've done your kickoff meetings, and you've made sure everyone knows everybody. You've got all your ducks in a row, and it's a really smooth onboarding process for that client. But candidates still, there's a massive black hole, and it's very, very easy to fix for me anyway. I think for companies, definitely leaders need to be reaching out. And a lot of this stuff can be automated as well. But if you've got that pre-onboarding, second the contract signed, candidates want to know what's happening next. And so having a founder reach out to them, or leader, hiring manager, whoever it is. No, it doesn't have to be a phone call. It could be a text message. It could be an email, whatever it is. But most have got like 4, 6, 8 weeks notice period. And it's about having those regular check-ins to make sure that they're really, really excited about it. And I think, there was so much drop off during COVID because so many people had other opportunities, and then people were reneging offers, etc. And a lot of the time, I think it could have been fixed if people would have had a really good onboarding process. So I think that early experience that a candidate has really shapes that commitment. And then I think so that structured communication, the founder welcome, again, like there's such easy things that you can do, like video content with we produce like video content on some lo-fi stuff with colleagues saying welcome to the team, etc., and sending an email with all the best coffee shops in the area, whatever it might be, just to try and help them feel really, really welcome. There's some really easy stuff. And I think as well, if you're in that GTM space, most of this can be automated. Probably might be on HubSpot or an equivalent platform where if you don't have your own HRIS program, you can just do it from you can automate a lot of this stuff. So I think that pre-onboarding piece is a really, really crucial piece, and where a lot of companies just go wrong because nobody knows who's doing what. Right the way through to finance, like getting forms done, etc., all can be automated, and then it gets that candidate really on the journey and excited. But then we kick into the reality of onboarding and starting on from day one. And I think having that structure from day one so that they know exactly what's going on, what's expected of them. They've done the interview. You want to make sure they're obviously wowed by you. Now it's the really important time to make sure the reality, the expectation meets the reality. I think like having that really structured onboarding process, all laid out for them. Small things like team lunches if you're in office, and in the first week, so people feel really welcome, etc., etc. And that all seems really straightforward, but some people don't do it. And then I think having that one, we call it like a 1-3-5, so one month, month 1, 3, and 5, and having those deliverables in place for that person, so that by month 5, let's say if you're on a 6-month probation period, by month 5, everybody knows where you stand. And I think having that structure in place from day one is really, really important. To make sure that people know exactly what they need to do for it all to work out as they all hope. So I think having that in place removes any sort of ambiguity, and obviously things like structured check-ins and so forth is super important as well. So you wouldn't, I don't know, I say this, you'd never close a customer and then disappear for 3 months. You'd be on that customer all the time. And unfortunately, some companies miss a beat with not having those regular check-ins with new employees. And I think great onboarding accelerates productivity, poor onboarding creates regret.
Mm. Yeah, it's some really valid points. And one thing I love that you addressed there was, how you can use systemization it's to some degree like automation to assist with that process. So it's not like left up to chance or, humans to have to do these things all the time, particularly if you've got like, you're a decent sized business, you've got a volume of people that are coming into the business. Like we've even done some stuff with setting up an employee onboarding experience through ClickUp, right, which we use for our sort of project management for client delivery. You could potentially do that stuff through a CRM like HubSpot as well, have like an employee onboarding pipeline. And that's something that I think could be relatively low lift. If you don't have like an HR system in place, that's something that could be really useful for most businesses, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think, look, it depends on how far you want to take it, but yeah, like we use Notion, for example, for everything that we do. And as you know, like we've got our own candidate handbook. So we're really open source. We want people to see under the bonnet before they come to us, before they join the business. And we've got everything. We've got our policies on there. There's some things that are hidden, of course, but we want to be as transparent as we possibly can, so that said the perception meets the reality when somebody joins. And for us, if we've got all our policies in place up there for a candidate to see, there's no problems there. There's absolutely everything when it comes to our values. You can read it all, and I'd be happy to share it with anybody if they want to get an example of what that looks like. And again, with AI, you can build those things really, really quickly. I probably spent, on my drive to work every morning, I'd just dictate the page and it'd be done for me by the time I get to the office. And we just keep building and building and building, and it's evergreen as well. So we'll just keep building to it, and our employers are adding to that as well, which is really, really exciting. So that transparency builds the trust, like I said at the start. And I think, that's been a really useful tool for us to be able to show candidates what it looks like. And then that's part of their onboarding as well. So they can always refer back to that. And they've, in some cases, they've read that before they've even joined. So they've already used to it as well.
Yeah, awesome. David, I guess let's say if you had your crystal ball here and you could look ahead to the future, let's say 3 to 5 years out, which seems like, a lifetime based off the pace that everything's running at the moment. What do you think is going to separate companies that are consistently winning top talent versus those that are struggling to hire?
Okay, I think talent density it'll increasingly separate market leaders from anyone else. I think talent will become a strategic differentiator. Definitely. I think that employer credibility will definitely compound. I think, we were talking about before, and I think leadership quality will magnetize talent. I think people want to know more. I was going to say this before, it's interesting, how people now want to get in the inner sanctum, and we, so watching, the Australian Open tennis, and it was showing the inner sanctums, and it's what people want to know. They all want to know behind the scenes, and I think that companies, I was thinking about that in talent as well, how companies want to get behind the scenes a lot more. Candidates want to get behind the scenes of companies so much more, which is why we've done the candidate handbook, as I mentioned before. But I think that, companies need to treat talent as a strategy, not just as a operational admin thing that they just have to do. And I think that employer reputation will compound, like brand equity would do as well. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of there to unpack. I think the great leaders will get great people if they get themselves out there and put them at the forefront. And the companies that consistently win talent are not necessarily the ones that are paying the most. I think those days, yes, salary is very important, and it's still very important, especially for the Gen Z, but it's not as much as what people think. And I think the ones that are creating the most compelling future are the ones that are going to win. And I think that's going to be a key thing for the next few years. But I might be wrong.
I'm sure if there's anyone who knows, you're the man. David, really appreciate your time. Thank you for spending the last half an hour or so with us. If people want to, say, learn a bit more about what you're doing or a bit about Fulcrum, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, well, LinkedIn obviously is probably the easiest channel. So definitely can reach me. You probably be able to find me, David Law at Fulcrum, or you can go to our website as well, which is wearefulcrum.com.
Awesome. David, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks, Kieran. Thanks for having me on. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Growth Unlocked Beyond Scale. If you enjoyed the show, it would really be appreciated if you can leave a 5-star review wherever you consume your podcasts. And while you're there, why not subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future episodes? If you'd like to learn about how to drive profitable scale in your business, gain clarity on your direction, and improve your business valuation, click the link in the show notes to connect with Kieran.